You lie twice a day on average. That's what the studies say. Small lies, harmless lies, lies you've already forgotten. But some people can't stop at twice a day. Some people lie when the truth would be easier, lie when there's nothing to gain, lie until they can't remember what's real anymore. Tonight, we're going inside that mind. Get comfortable, settle in, let the noise of the day fade into the background. There's no rush, just you and the dark, and something worth understanding. Tonight, 3 stages of a descent. We'll start with the compulsive liar, the person who lies without reason, without benefit, without being able to stop. The mechanism that turns lying from a choice into a reflex. Then we'll go deeper, into the mind that starts believing its own lies, where the boundary between memory and invention dissolves, where the liar becomes trapped in a reality they invented. And finally, the complete transformation. The person who doesn't just tell lies, but becomes one, who erases their original self and builds a new identity from nothing, who lives for years, decades as someone who doesn't exist. By the end, you'll understand something unsettling. The line between truth and lies is thinner than you think, and everyone is closer to crossing it than they realize. In 2008, psychiatrist Charles Dyke published a landmark paper on pathological lying. He wanted to answer a simple question: why do some people lie when they don't have to? Normal lying makes sense. You lie to avoid punishment, to gain advantage, to protect someone's feelings. There's a reason, a calculation, a benefit that outweighs the risk. This is instrumental lying. It's rational, it's strategic, it's what most people do most of the time. But Dyke identified something different. Some people lie when there's nothing to gain, when the truth would be easier, when getting caught is almost certain. They lie anyway. This is compulsive lying, and it doesn't follow the rules of normal deception. The compulsive liar lies about things that don't matter: what they had for breakfast, where they went last weekend, small details with no stakes. They lie about things that are easily checked, facts that anyone could verify with a quick search. They lie even when the lie makes them look worse than the truth would. Why? Dyke's research suggested something important. For compulsive liars, lying has become the default, the path of least resistance. Their brains have adapted to deception as the normal mode of communication. Think about what happens when you tell the truth. You access a memory, you translate it into words, you share it. It's straightforward. One path. Now think about what happens when you lie. You access the real memory, you construct an alternative, you monitor the other person's reaction. You remember what you said for later consistency. It's cognitively demanding, multiple paths running simultaneously. For most people, lying is harder than truth-telling. The mental effort is greater. That's part of why we default to honesty. It's easier. But for compulsive liars, something shifts. The lying pathway becomes so well-worn, so automatic, that it requires less effort than the truth. Lying becomes the reflex. Truth becomes the effort. Neuroimaging studies have found differences in the brains of pathological liars. Specifically, they have more white matter in the prefrontal cortex. White matter is the wiring that connects different brain regions. More white matter means more connectivity. More connectivity means more ability to juggle complex information. The kind of information you need to juggle when you're maintaining a web of lies. This doesn't mean liars are born with different brains. It might be the opposite. The brain changes in response to behavior. Practice anything enough and the brain adapts. Practice lying enough and the brain becomes optimized for it. This is the trap of compulsive lying. The more you lie, the easier lying becomes. The easier it becomes, the more you do it. The more you do it, the more your brain adapts, until lying isn't a choice anymore. It's just what you do, now. There's a case that shows this mechanism pushed to its extreme. A woman who built an empire on a lie, who kept lying even when confronted with proof, who seemed unable to stop even when stopping was the only thing that could save her. Her name was Belle Gibson. Gibson grew up in Australia. Her childhood was difficult, by her own account at least. She described neglect, abuse, raising her younger siblings. Whether these stories were true is hard to know, because with Gibson, every story is suspect. In her early 20s, Gibson claimed she had been diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. She was given months to live, but she didn't accept the diagnosis. She rejected conventional medicine. and through diet, alternative therapies, and sheer will, she healed herself. The story was inspiring. It was exactly what people wanted to hear. That cancer could be beaten naturally, that the medical establishment didn't have all the answers, that one brave young woman had found another way. Gibson built a brand around this story. She created an app called The Whole Pantry, healthy recipes that she credited with saving her life. The app was downloaded hundreds of thousands of times. She got a book deal. She became a wellness celebrity, speaking at events, appearing on television. She announced she was donating large portions of her profits to charity. She was beloved. There was just one problem. She had never had cancer. When journalists started investigating, the story fell apart. No medical records, no doctors who had treated her, no evidence of any diagnosis. When confronted, Gibson didn't confess. She adapted. She changed her story. She claimed different cancers: brain cancer, blood cancer, spleen cancer, uterus cancer, liver cancer. The number kept growing. When pressed for proof, she couldn't provide any. When asked directly if she had ever had cancer, she finally admitted the truth. Sort of. No, none of it is true. But here's what matters for understanding compulsive lying. Gibson didn't stop lying after she was caught. In subsequent interviews, she continued to lie. About the charities she had donated to, she hadn't. About her childhood, stories that kept shifting, about her current health, new claims that couldn't be verified. She had been exposed, publicly humiliated, prosecuted for misleading conduct. The logical thing would be to stop, to come clean, to rebuild on truth. She couldn't. The lying wasn't a strategy anymore, it was a reflex. The mechanism had become so ingrained that she couldn't switch it off. Even when lying was destroying her, she kept doing it. Gibson was fined for her false claims about charitable donations, but the fine was almost impossible to collect. She claimed she had no money. Whether that was true or another lie, no one could be certain. With Gibson, nothing is certain. Compulsive lying is the first stage, the inability to stop, the reflex that overrides reason. But there's a deeper stage, one where the liar doesn't just tell lies. Reflexively, they start to believe them, where the boundary between what happened and what they said happened begins to blur, where they become trapped in a reality of their own invention. This is where lying stops being deception and becomes something closer to delusion. In 1891, a German psychiatrist named Anton Delbruck described a condition he had observed in several patients. They told elaborate lies, but not like ordinary liars. They seemed to believe what they were saying. He called it pseudologia fantastica, fantastic lying. The term captures something important. These aren't ordinary lies, they're fantasies. Elaborate, detailed, often grandiose stories that the teller has constructed. Stories about their past, their achievements, their suffering. Stories that they tell so often with such conviction that something strange happens. They start to believe them. This is different from compulsive lying. The compulsive liar knows they're lying. They may not be able to stop, but they know the truth. The pseudologia fantastica patient has lost that distinction. The lie and the truth have merged in their mind. They're not deceiving anymore. They're remembering things that never happened. How is this possible? The answer lies in how memory works. Psychologist Elizabeth Loftus spent decades studying false memories. Her research revealed something disturbing. Memory isn't a recording, it's a reconstruction. Every time you remember something, you're not playing back a tape. You're rebuilding the memory from pieces, and every time you rebuild it, it can change. Loftus showed that she could implant false memories in experimental subjects. With the right suggestions, people would remember events that never happened. Getting lost in a mall as a child, spilling punch at a wedding, nearly drowning. Events that were completely invented. But the subjects didn't experience them as inventions. They experienced them as memories. They could describe details. They had emotional reactions. They were certain. If false memories can be implanted from outside, they can also be generated from inside. Tell a story enough times, and the brain starts to encode it like a memory. The neural pathways strengthen. The emotional associations build. The fiction becomes indistinguishable from fact. This is the mechanism behind pseudologia fantastica. The liar tells a story. They tell it again and again. Each telling reinforces it. until it's no longer a story they're telling. It's a memory they're accessing. They've lied themselves into believing. Now, there's a case that demonstrates this with devastating clarity. A woman who claimed to have survived one of the worst tragedies in American history, who became a leader among survivors, who comforted others who had lost loved ones, and who had made the entire thing up. Her name was Tanya Head. On September 11th, 2001, Tanya Head was in the South Tower of the World Trade Center. That was her story. She was on the 78th floor when the plane hit. In the chaos, a dying man handed her his wedding ring and asked her to give it to his wife. She was badly burned. She nearly died. And her fiancé, who worked in the North Tower, did die. She never saw him again. The story was horrific, and it was compelling. Tanya threw herself into survivor advocacy. She joined the World Trade Center Survivors Network. She rose quickly through the organization. Eventually, she became its president. As president, she led tours of Ground Zero. She spoke at memorials. She comforted other survivors. She shared her story again and again with devastating emotional detail. People who met her described her as deeply authentic. Her pain seemed real. Her trauma seemed real. But none of it was real. Tanya Head, whose real name was Alicia Esteve Head, was not in New York on September 11, 2001. She was in Barcelona. She had no fiancé in the North Tower. The dying man with the wedding ring never existed. None of it happened. When the truth emerged, people struggled to understand. How could someone fake this? How could someone lie about something so sacred? How could she sit with real survivors, real widows, and pretend? But here's the question that matters most. Was she pretending? People who knew Tanya described her emotional responses as genuine. She cried when she talked about 9/11. She had physical reactions, trembling, difficulty breathing. When visiting Ground Zero, she seemed to experience real trauma symptoms. Pseudologia fantastica might explain this. Tanya told her story so many times with such intensity that her brain may have encoded it as memory. She wasn't accessing a lie. She was accessing what felt to her like a real experience. The tears were real. The trauma was real. The experience behind them was not. After she was exposed, Tanya disappeared from public life. She never fully explained herself. She never admitted to conscious deception. Because she may not have experienced it as deception. In her mind, she may have been Tanya Head, 9/11 survivor. The lie had become her truth. Pseudologia fantastica is the second stage, not just lying reflexively, believing the lies, becoming trapped in a fiction that feels like memory. But there's one more stage, the deepest one, where the liar doesn't just believe a story, they become someone else entirely. Sociologist Irving Goffman wrote a famous book called The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. His argument was simple but profound. We're all performing, all the time. When you go to work, you perform professional self. When you're with your family, you perform family self. When you meet a stranger, you perform public self. These aren't lies exactly. They're roles, versions of yourself adapted to context. Goffman argued that there may be no true self behind the performances, just layers of performance all the way down. The self is not something you have, it's something you do. This is uncomfortable to think about. We want to believe in an authentic core, a real self underneath the roles. But Goffman suggests the roles are all there is. If that's true, if identity is performance, then a disturbing possibility opens up. What if someone performed a completely different self, not just adapted themselves to context, but invented a new person entirely, and performed that person so completely that the original self disappeared? This is identity fabrication, the most extreme form of lying, where the lie isn't something you tell, it's someone you become. The psychology of identity fabrication involves several mechanisms. First, there's the rejection of the original self. People who fabricate identities often hate who they really are. They see their real self as worthless, boring, shameful. The false identity offers an escape, a chance to be someone who matters. Second, there's the addictive quality of being someone else. When you're performing a more impressive version of yourself, life feels better. People treat you differently. You treat yourself differently. The performance becomes preferable to reality. Third, there's the deepening investment. The longer you maintain the false identity, the more you've put into it. Relationships built on the lie, status achieved through the lie, a whole life constructed on a foundation of fiction. Going back to the original self would mean losing all of it. So you keep going, deeper and deeper into someone who doesn't exist. Now, there's a man who lived this more completely than almost anyone in history, who spent over 2 decades as someone he invented, who married, had a child, and built a life in high society as a member of one of America's most famous families, who fooled everyone, and who was hiding something far darker than a false name. He called himself Clark Rockefeller. In the 1980s, a young man appeared in elite social circles on the East Coast. He introduced himself as Clark Rockefeller, a member of the famous family, heir to one of the greatest fortunes in American history. He was charming, confident, eccentric in the way that very wealthy people can afford to be. He collected art, he sailed, he spoke with authority about business and politics. He belonged, people accepted him without much question. The Rockefeller name opened doors, and Clark played the part perfectly. He didn't act rich, he was rich, or at least he had become someone who was. He married a successful businesswoman named Sandra Boss. She was brilliant, a Harvard MBA, a McKinsey partner, and she never suspected. For 12 years of marriage, she believed she was married to a Rockefeller. They had a daughter together. They lived in a world of wealth and privilege. None of it was real. Clark Rockefeller was born Christian Karl Gerhartsreiter in Germany in 1961. He came to America at 17 on a tourist visa. He never left, and he never stopped becoming other people. Before he was Clark Rockefeller, he was Christopher Crowe, a television producer. Before that, he was Christopher Chichester, an English aristocrat. Before that, he was Chris Gerhardt, a student. Each identity was more elaborate than the last. Each one moved him further from the person he had started as. By the time he became Clark Rockefeller, Christian Gerhartsreiter had effectively ceased to exist. The lie worked for decades, but lies this big have a way of unraveling. His marriage fell apart. His wife discovered financial irregularities. Then she discovered there was no Rockefeller fortune. Then she discovered there was no Rockefeller. She divorced him and got custody of their daughter. In 2008, during a supervised visit, Rockefeller kidnapped his daughter. A nationwide search followed, and investigators started digging into who this man really was. What they found went beyond identity fraud. In 1985, a young couple named John and Linda Sohus had disappeared from San Marino, California. They were last seen around the time Christopher Chichester was renting a guest house on the property owned by John's mother. For decades, it was an unsolved mystery. Then, in 1994, bones were discovered in the backyard. John Sohus's bones. The investigation stalled. No one could find Christopher Chichester. Because Christopher Chichester didn't exist anymore. He had become Clark Rockefeller. When Rockefeller was finally arrested for the kidnapping, investigators connected the dots. Fingerprints matched. Christopher Chichester was Christian Gerhartsreiter was Clark Rockefeller. And he was charged with the murder of John Sohus. He was convicted in 2013. In the courtroom, he maintained the Rockefeller persona. He seemed to believe on some level that he really was this person he had invented. The performance had gone on so long that there might have been nothing left underneath. Christian Gerhartsreiter didn't just tell lies, he became a lie. He erased his original self so completely that it may have been unrecoverable. The identity fabrication consumed him, and it consumed others too. This is the terminal stage of the liar's journey, not just lying reflexively like Belle Gibson, not just believing your own lies like Tanya Head, but disappearing into the lie entirely, becoming someone who doesn't exist, and being willing to do anything to protect that fiction, even murder. Tonight we traced a descent, from the lies we all tell to the lies that consume everything. We saw compulsive lying, pseudologia fantastica, and identity fabrication. 3 stages, 3 cases, 1 continuous thread, we all lie. The studies say twice a day. But the machinery that enables those small lies is the same machinery that enabled Belle Gibson, Tanya Head, and Clark Rockefeller. The difference is degree, how far down the path you go. The compulsive liar loses the ability to choose truth. The pseudologia fantastica patient loses the ability to know truth. The identity fabricator loses the self that could have told the truth. Each stage is harder to return from. Each one takes you further from reality. And here's the unsettling part. The boundary between each stage isn't a wall, it's a slope. Each lie makes the next one easier. Each fiction, told enough times, starts to feel like fact. Each role, performed long enough, starts to feel like identity. We like to think we're different from these people, that there's a clear line between us and them. But the line is thinner than we want to believe. The same mechanisms exist in everyone. The same slope is available to all of us. What keeps most people from descending isn't a different brain, it's friction. Small moments of reality that interrupt the lie. People who know the truth, consequences that make lying costly, a self that feels worth telling the truth about. The liars we met tonight lost that friction, and once they started sliding, they couldn't stop. Thank you for staying with me tonight. Sleep well.